Hi, welcome to Mr. Block Explains the Causes and Effects of the American Revolution. So mostly we haven't been focusing on America outside the Columbian Exchange for a good amount of reasons. But this is we're going to take a quick little detour from Europe into the Americas and see what's happening because it is very much correlated to the things we've been talking about within this unit of Unit 4. So let's get to the start of the causes of the American Revolution. First off, the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, we have here guys like Rousseau and Hobbes and Locke and Adam Smith and Montesquieu. They're writing ideas really influenced the colonial leaders and the purposes and the powers of the government and made them challenge and think about the different ways that we should view the government, kind of as we've been discussing. Also, the Age of Exploration, as North America was being colonized by the British and the French, because there was a lot of valuable resources there and a lot for mercantilism to take a big role. Again, that drive for power, the drive for wealth, that drive for resources and land and money. So the British and the French were taking big advantage of that, and the Americans were starting to realize that, hey, we're being utilized against our own will in that way. Number three is that the French and Indian War, there was a lot of debt that was sustained by the British, so they were fighting over a lot of the area over here in pink, and the French sided up with the Native Americans, and the British actually won the war, but it was such a long and costly war that eventually they decided that, hey, we have to raise taxes on the American colonists because we are losing too much money fighting a war across the ocean in the Americas. And then with this, also the British started to maintain tighter control on the entire colonial area with more and more laws that kept the American colonists kind of unhappy, or some of them at least, and wanted to see changed. And with this, with the control and the rise from taxes from Britain, the American nationalist movement started, the colonists began to unify together to say, hey, this isn't okay. We want to become our own nation and make something separate. So first thing, again, like the Enlightenment, yeah, your guys like philosophers like Montesquieu, Rousseau, who create these new ideas and going over these same kind of ideas that we talked about before, the social contract, the exchange between, people and the government about how giving up, your freedoms for protection, and how that should be and what is just within that. A limited government where you don't have a king who is, trying to do everything on his own and is being an absolute monarch. Not that King George III was an absolute monarch, but he almost got vilified or treated like a villain in that way because the colonists didn't like having a king who didn't really care about a colony overseas. The consent of the governed, meaning that people have freedom to choose who is ruling over them, and in separation of powers, again, dividing the branches of government amongst themselves. So then you have higher British control, like the Sugar Act, and other goods. So they started to tax things that the American colonists needed because tea was a really big good back then. It's almost like the way we drink coffee today. There's the way that tea was drunk back then. And so if you put, you're going to put sugar in your tea, guess what? A lot of colonists used that. And so the sugar that got taxed, which increased the prices, places any other than what they did was that they increased the taxes on tea coming from any other place other than Britain. And so that way you were incentivized to buy British sugar because it was cheaper. But the colonists didn't like that because that's not quite fair. And then the colonists also had to provide British troops in America money and living quarters and supplies at will. If the British troops came in and decided that, hey, we want to stay here, they were allowed to. It's called the Quartering Act. And that didn't go over well with the American colonists. Then they also had the Tea Act, and the Tea Act is which the colonists could only buy British tea. And they had to pay a tax before they could get the British tea. So even more money and influence that's going straight into the British pockets from the American colonists. So it's a lot more of a monopoly, a lot more control. And then the Stamp Act was taxes on paper goods like newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, playing cards, legal statements. And the problem with that is those that any paper that you're going to use, say you're a merchant or a businessman or a lawyer, you're going to have to use paper, and the paper you're only allowed to use had to be approved by the British, and you had to pay an extra tax on that paper. And so it really started to agonize a lot of people. Imagine if I said, hey, you can borrow a sheet of paper from me, but give me a quarter, and that's how we're going to make it work. Oh, and you can't go to another teacher and get paper for free. You have to get it from me. So that kind of became a big problem for the British. And also in this rise of American nationalism is when the colonists basically said to the British that they couldn't tax the colonies because they weren't represented in Parliament. And that's a big, big key, this idea of taxation without representation. The idea, because there were no colonial seats in Parliament, so they don't have a representative. Like North Carolina has a representative and has a number of representatives and senators in Congress, which represent the people. We have representation. Doesn't mean it's always going to work out for us, but the American colonists had nobody. They were being just used as a colony. And so no one's voicing their opinions, no one's standing up for them. And eventually kind of got into a peak and the tension started to bubble over, and which then begins the revolution. And it starts to lead to some violence because they felt it was really unfair that they weren't having a say, they weren't having a representation in the British legislative. But yet they were being taxed incredibly heavily and probably unfairly. And then so what the colonists started to do is they started to organize a boycott of British goods. And what the boycott means is that you're not going to buy British goods. So you're going to hit them where it hurts, in the wallet. Because if all of a sudden, if the British are forcing you to say, hey, you can only buy these goods from us, the easy thing to do is to say, okay, we're not going to buy these goods. We're going to boycott them. That way, you are not going to make any money off the goods that you're trying to monopolize over us. And hopefully to force the British to change these laws in hopes of getting more fair prices and such. And there's this group called the Sons of Liberty who formed to organize these protests, and they would tar and feather British officers, and which is a very cruel kind of process to humiliate them and force them to drink tea, as you can see in the picture here. And they were starting to become nationalist, as in their way of, we care about our country, we don't care about the British, and we want our country to, become better and better every day. And eventually this protest led to the Boston Massacre. So it starts again to boil over into warfare. And so the Boston Massacre was one of more of the things that kind of led to the war, the Revolutionary War. You have a bunch of soldiers who were starting to get harassed by some protesters. It was cold in Boston, and so they started to throw snowballs and ice at and rocks at the soldiers. And so the ruckus started happening, and the British troops actually fired upon the protesters and killed 5 of them. And this may not seem like that big of a deal, but then it got portrayed in the papers looking like this, where you have the British troops just absolutely firing and killing, looks like loads of, American colonists for what looks like they're doing nothing when there's actually like a riot going on. And so there's a lot of blame. I'm not saying one is right or the other. But all of a sudden, this image gets out in the paper, and people start to worry about, hey, what are the British doing? They're out here killing American civilians. That's not okay. King George has done enough. We got to end British rule here. And then that led to the Boston Tea Party. In response to the Tea Act and also the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party was when you had a bunch of American nationalists, and what they did is they snuck onto the British trading ships dressed up as Native Americans, and they dumped all the tea into the harbor to waste the British goods and to waste the British money that you could never get back. And essentially that cost the British a lot and started to aggravate the British there. And then as the tensions began to rise and rise and rise, eventually it leads to the Revolutionary War. And this started off in Lexington and Concord when the first battles happened, and the war took a good number of years eventually. And that is essentially what happened with the American Revolution in the lead up to it. Let me know if you have any questions for your guiding notes, and I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.